They say vengeance is a path with no return, but in the frozen wilds, one knight defied death itself to claim his retribution. His name is whispered in fear. His howl echoes through the night. This is the tale of blood, snow, and wrath. Welcome to Darkverse AI. The frost clung to the earth like a death shroud, turning the fields outside Sir Aldrich's home into a glistening graveyard of silence. Winter had always been merciless in these lands, but it had never felt cruel, until now. Aldrich dismounted his horse, boots crunching over the brittle snow as he approached the smoldering remains of his cottage. Smoke curled weakly into the slate-gray sky, mingling with the bitter scent of charred wood and something far worse. His heart pounded as his eyes traced the frozen path of blood streaked across the snow. "Elsbeth," he called, voice trembling. "Rayan." No answer. Only the low howl of the wind replied, as if mocking his desperation. The silence was its own form of violence. His gauntleted hands trembled as he pushed open the scorched door, the creak of the wood splitting the stillness like a scream. Inside, the air was thick with ash and death. Aldrich fell to his knees as he saw them. His wife, Elsbeth, crumpled in the corner, her lifeless eyes wide with terror. Near her lay Rayan, their son, his small body limp and broken. The knight's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring with tears. His family, his reason for enduring the brutal winters and endless wars, was gone. A single arrow lay embedded in the wall, its fletching marked with a jagged red slash. A sigil Aldrich knew all too well. The Red Fang, a ruthless band of marauders who had terrorized the region for years. Rage ignited in his chest, burning hotter than the embers beneath the ruins. He clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. The world blurred into a haze of grief and fury. "This will not go unanswered," he growled, his voice guttural, almost feral. He swore an oath then and there, his words a promise to the dead and a curse upon the living. He would find the Red Fang. He would make them pay. Aldrich buried his family beneath a frozen oak at the edge of the forest, their graves marked by simple stones he had carved with trembling hands. The frost-bitten earth resisted his efforts, but he pressed on until his body screamed for rest. When the final mound was smoothed over, he knelt before the graves, his sword plunged into the frozen ground before him. "I swear it," he murmured, his breath misting in the cold air. "No matter the cost, I will make them suffer." The oath echoed in the quiet, and the wind seemed to carry it away into the endless expanse of the wilderness. Aldrich rose, his grief sharpening into a deadly resolve. The first snows of a bitter storm began to fall as he set out on horseback, following the faint tracks the marauders had left behind. He clutched his sword tightly, its hilt a lifeline to the man he once was. The land stretched before him, an unending sea of white and gray, the mountains in the distance jagged and foreboding. Days passed, each one colder and crueler than the last. Aldrich's provisions dwindled, and the weight of his armor became a burden. The wind tore at his face, biting through the cracks in his cloak. His horse stumbled and faltered, its breath shallow and labored. When the poor creature finally collapsed, Aldrich stood in the freezing wind, stroking its neck as it shivered in the snow. "Rest, old friend," he whispered, his voice hoarse. With a heavy heart, he drew his blade and ended its suffering, leaving its body behind as he continued on foot. The wilderness seemed to close in around him. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The howling wind carried strange sounds, cracks of ice, the distant baying of wolves. Aldrich tightened his grip on his sword, his breath steaming in the bitter cold, but the tracks were there, faint and scattered. The Red Fang had passed this way, and their trail led deeper into the heart of the frozen wilds. The nights were the worst. The cold became an unrelenting torment, gnawing at his fingers and toes, seeping into his very bones. His rations were gone, and the meager fire he managed to build offered little warmth against the biting frost. He dreamt of his family, their faces pale and ghostly, calling to him from the shadows of the trees. "Why didn't you save us?" their voices whispered. He would wake drenched in sweat, the fire long since extinguished. Each morning, he felt less like a man and more like a hollow shell, driven only by rage and grief. The wolves came soon after. At first, he thought they were just shadows, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness from the edges of his vision. But they were real, following him, their howls haunting the night. They were waiting for him to fall. One fateful evening, as the storm reached its peak, Aldrich stumbled into a clearing. The snow fell in thick sheets, blinding him, the wind screaming in his ears. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees, his sword slipping from his frozen fingers. The wolves emerged from the darkness, their forms sleek and powerful, their eyes gleaming like molten gold. They circled him, their growls low and guttural. Aldrich looked up at them, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "So this is how it ends," he muttered, a bitter smile on his lips. He had failed his family. He had failed his oath. The largest wolf stepped forward, its fur black as midnight, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. It stared at him unblinking, its breath steaming in the frozen air. Aldrich's vision blurred, his body succumbing to the cold. In his delirium, he thought he heard a voice, low and primal, speaking directly to his mind. "You seek vengeance," it growled, "but vengeance comes with a price." He felt the weight of the wolf's gaze, its presence overwhelming, as if the wilderness itself had taken form before him. "I'll pay it," Aldrich whispered, his voice trembling. "Whatever it takes." The wolf's jaws parted, revealing gleaming fangs. "Then rise, hunter. Become what you must to claim your vengeance." The pack surged forward, their forms enveloping him in a whirlwind of shadows and teeth. Pain seared through Aldrich's body as their claws raked across his skin, their fangs tearing into him. He screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the howling wind. When the storm finally passed, the clearing was empty. The snow was stained crimson, but there was no sign of the night or the wolves. Aldrich awoke in the pre-dawn gloom, his body alive with sensations he could barely comprehend. The once dull air of the wilderness now thrummed with life. He could hear the faint rustle of a hare's paws beneath the snow, the creak of distant trees swaying in the wind. Scents swirled around him, pine, damp earth, the metallic tang of blood carried on the icy breeze. He rose to his feet, his body light and powerful, the fatigue of his mortal form a distant memory. His hands, now clawed and sinewy, flexed with a strength that made his sword feel like a toy. He didn't need to think about what to do next. The primal instincts of the wolf guided him. He found the trail quickly. The red-fanged scent hung in the air, a pungent mixture of sweat, leather, and blood. Each step they had taken was etched into the snow, invisible to mortal eyes but clear as day to Aldrich. The grooves of their boots, the faint drops of spilled wine from their stolen bounty, even the subtle indentations of a wounded man dragging his leg. It was all laid bare before him. He dropped to all fours, his claws scraping against the frozen ground as he moved with eerie silence. The wind shifted and the scent grew stronger, mingled with the acrid smoke of a distant fire. The bandits were close. Aldrich crept through the forest, his glowing amber eyes piercing the darkness. He heard their voices long before he saw them, rough and boisterous, their laughter grating against his heightened senses. The pack of wolves flanked him, their movements synchronized, their breathing calm and deliberate. They were his allies now, bound to him by the transformation, and they obeyed his unspoken commands. Through the trees, he saw the flicker of firelight. The Red Fang's camp lay nestled in a hollow between two ridges, sheltered from the worst of the storm. Aldrich's lips curled into a snarl, his sharp teeth gleaming in the pale moonlight. The hunt was over. The slaughter was about to begin. Aldrich's approach was as silent as death itself. His claws sank into the snow without a sound, his movements fluid and predatory. The wolves fanned out, their glowing eyes watching him for the signal. He paused at the edge of the camp, taking in every detail. The placement of the guards, the drunken stupor of the men around the fire, the distant sound of snores from those already asleep. The first guard fell without a sound. Aldrich leapt from the shadows, his claws slashing across the man's throat before he could raise an alarm. Blood spattered across the snow as the guard crumpled, his body disappearing into the dark as Aldrich dragged him away. The wolves struck next. 3 of them descended upon a pair of bandits standing near the edge of the camp, their fangs tearing into flesh with savage precision. The men's screams were brief, cut short by the crunch of bone and the gurgle of blood. Panic rippled through the camp as the remaining bandits scrambled to arm themselves. Aldrich moved through the chaos like a specter, his sword a blur of steel and death. He swung with brutal efficiency, severing limbs and cleaving through armor as if it were paper. His amber eyes glowed with a feral light, his snarls mingling with the cries of the dying. One bandit charged at him with a spear, the weapon aimed at Aldrich's chest. Aldrich sidestepped with inhuman speed, his claws lashing out to snap the spear in two. Before the man could react, Aldrich's hand closed around his throat, lifting him off the ground. The bandit's eyes bulged as he clawed at Aldrich's grip, his breaths coming in choked gasps. "You took everything from me," Aldrich growled, his voice a guttural snarl. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled the man into the fire, his screams echoing into the night as flames consumed him. The leader of the Red Fang emerged from his tent, his sword drawn, his face twisted with fury and fear. He barked orders at the remaining men, rallying them into a desperate stand. Aldrich met his gaze, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Face me, coward!" the leader roared, his voice shaking. "If you're man enough." Aldrich stepped forward, his claws flexing, his lips curling into a feral grin. "I am no man," he said, his voice cold and inhuman. "I am your reckoning." The battle that followed was brief and brutal. Aldrich tore through the remaining bandits with a savagery that left the snow red and steaming. The leader fought valiantly, his blade flashing with desperation as he swung with all his might. He was skilled, his movements honed by years of bloodshed, but he was facing something far beyond mortal. Aldrich deflected the first strike with ease, his sword ringing against the leader's blade. The clash echoed through the night, sending a ripple of fear through the remaining bandits who dared to watch. The leader roared and charged, aiming a brutal slash at Aldrich's chest. Aldrich sidestepped with unnatural speed, his claws slashing through the air in response, tearing through the man's armor and scoring deep gashes across his side. Blood splattered across the snow, and the leader staggered but did not fall. "Is that all you have?" Aldrich growled, his voice a deep guttural snarl. The leader bared his teeth, determination flashing in his eyes as he launched another attack, his blade slicing through the air in a desperate flurry. But Aldrich was relentless. He parried each blow effortlessly, his glowing amber eyes locked onto the man's face with chilling intensity. With a feral roar, Aldrich seized an opening, slamming the leader to the ground with a force that shook the earth beneath them. The leader gasped, his sword knocked from his hand, his body pinned beneath Aldrich's immense strength. "You brought this upon yourself," Aldrich snarled, his fangs bared as he drove his sword through the leader's chest with unrelenting force. The man's final gasp was a choked whimper, his body shuddering before falling still, his blood pooling beneath him and steaming in the frigid air. When it was over, the camp was silent. The fires burned low, casting flickering shadows over the carnage. Aldrich stood amidst the bodies, his breath steaming in the cold air. The wolves gathered around him, their howls rising into the night, a haunting chorus of triumph. Aldrich looked down at his blood-stained hands, the claws slick with the remnants of his vengeance. The rage that had fueled him was gone, leaving only emptiness in its place. He had avenged his family, but at the cost of his humanity. The wilderness had claimed him, and there was no going back.